Before we move on, I do want to mention a few upcoming events for the Oley Foundation. May 27th at 7 p.m., we will have Community Connections, and that's a virtual event. At June 3rd at 11 a.m., we will have Home Nutrition Support, your top questions answered, and that'll be a virtual webinar. And then June 17th through the 20th, we'll have our 2025 annual Oley Conference in Charleston, South Carolina. You do not want to miss that. I'm excited to introduce our speaker today. Jessie Birnbaum has a bachelor's degree in psychology from Wake Forest University and is graduating from the School of Social Work at Boston University. She also has lived experience with multiple chronic illnesses. She is here to share her story and what she has learned along the way. Jessie also runs a free support group online for individuals with chronic illnesses. Here to tell her story, let's welcome Jessie. Jessie, thank you for being here today. Go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much, Vince. I'm so honored to be here with all the Florida folks and everyone else. I have family who live in Boca Raton, if anyone is near there. I'm going to go to, if it'll work, the next. Oh, it went all the way to the end. Okay, we'll get a little sneak peek. I'm going to go to the first slide to just tell a little bit more about myself, because I feel like it can be kind of weird to hear from people when you don't really know anything about them. So as Vince said, my name's Jessie. I actually this past weekend graduated with my master's. I'm from Los Angeles, a little embarrassed to admit it. I feel like people have stereotypes about LA. I've actually been told I seem like I'm from New Jersey, and I kind of own that. My experience has mostly been with OCD. So I have had OCD since I was a little kid, and then wasn't diagnosed until I was around 14 years old. So it can take a really long time, if anyone's familiar with OCD specifically, but with a lot of mental illnesses, it can take a really long time to kind of nail down what that is. So it took me a very long time. And then when I was around a sophomore in college, so around 2020, which all the doctors like to think is related to COVID, but I don't think it is. I started getting really sick, and I had never experienced any sort of chronic illness ever. I had always gone to my physicals as a kid and like went and got like the little sticker, and I was great. And I was like, I love the doctor. And then I started getting really sick. It all started with headaches, and it progressed really far from there. I got diagnosed with Crohn's disease, which later became a misdiagnosis. Now I live with POTS, MCAS, MALS, endometriosis. It would take the whole time to keep going on, but it's really uprooted my life. So it's kind of led to this specific niche where I work with people with anxiety and also chronic illness. And as you'll hear in this presentation, I'm very much a believer that if you have any sort of chronic illness and go through this kind of crazy medical system that we go through, I think there's kind of no way to go through it without experiencing some form of anxiety. Not saying that's an anxiety disorder, but I think, the medical system is kind of wild, as I think we all have experienced. And then just some like fun facts. I really love pickleball, which has been a little harder to play, admittedly, with my diagnoses. I'm a big Wake Forest football fan. I hate on hold music, or the hold music for medical offices. That's like my gripe, when they put you on that like music that just is always horrible. Like I'd love for them to put like literally anything else. And then I'm a big reality TV show fan. If anyone saw the new series Love on the Spectrum, the new season, I thought it was great. Big fan. For this presentation, I'm gonna go a little bit into kind of like background of like anxiety versus chronic illness and kind of how those two interplay. And then we'll do all like tips and different like practical skills and solutions that I really like to implement with clients of my own and with people in my group. So as Vince said, I run a group for individuals. I run one for people with OCD and chronic illness, and then I run another for people with chronic illness. And if you're interested in joining, it's free. I think Vince had said you could just email the Oley Foundation, and I'd be happy to have anyone join. Wanted to go a little bit into just kind of some examples of what anxiety is. And many of you might be familiar with this already. But as I said before, I'm a really big believer that even if you don't have a diagnosed anxiety disorder, that there's so much anxiety that comes from living with a chronic illness that you've probably experienced some form of anxiety. So these are just some, as I mentioned, I work with OCD a lot, so I put that on here, as well as generalized anxiety disorder. Something I also see a lot is health anxiety, which gets really hard when I myself have experienced a lot of health anxiety when, you have like a mole and you're like, oh my God, is it cancer? And it's more anxiety fueling it than perhaps like real medical concern. But that can be really tough when you're constantly going to the doctor and constantly having chronic illness symptoms. So that's definitely something that can be very challenging at the interplay of these. Generalized anxiety, just to give a brief overview, is more of this like general worry. So for me, I live with GAD is what we call it. And for me, a lot of that was like when I was in school, I had a lot of stress around school and my grades, and it was more of this like general worry, as opposed to living with OCD is more specific worry about intrusive thoughts and doing compulsions for the obsessions. Then, as I said, there's this everyday anxiety. And that's what I'm really going to focus on in this presentation. So I think we're going to put up a poll in a second, but basically with this slide, what I really wanted to highlight is that life with these illnesses causes anxiety. I think this is why it's so cool for me to see that there are healthcare providers here and caregivers here, because I think a lot of people don't understand how much anxiety comes from making phone calls to all these doctors and insurance companies, insurance in general, trying to get doctors to believe you. I know I had so many instances, and people in my groups will talk all the time about going to a doctor and they're like, what do you mean? Like, this doesn't happen. This is crazy. This is absurd. I've never heard of this. And when you have things that are less specific or they're less commonly known, I have a few like rare conditions, and doctors don't really get it a lot of the times. And there are some amazing doctors out there who do, but it can be hard to find them. There's the anxiety that comes from explaining your condition to others. We were just talking in one of my groups last night about like now that it's warmer outside and it's kind of like summertime. I'm sure it is very warm in Florida. But now that it's like warm outside, there's more like socializing that goes on outside, and you may have been indoors a little more and now you're outside more, having to meet up with people that maybe you haven't seen in a while, and they're asking how you're doing. And it's kind of a loaded question when you live with a chronic illness, to say like, yeah, like I'm fine, like it hasn't really gone away. I know I've explained to people and they're like, she's not better yet, or they'll tell my parents like, how is she not better yet? And they just don't really get that it's chronic. There's the financial burden. I think we all know that very well, that a lot of this stuff is really expensive. Next one we call in my groups ping ponged to different doctors, because as I'm sure many of you have experienced, when you don't have a really well-known diagnosis, you can really get, oh, go to the cardiologist, and then the cardiologist says to go to the dermatologist, and then you get thrown to the different ists, and it's just kind of a constant cycle of ping-ponging from one doctor to another. A lot of our conditions will lead to feeling really fatigued. So pretending like you have energy, having to cancel plans at the last minute, worrying that others think you're lazy, flaky. And then this like deciding like, am I really going to go into the whole story? I'm at a barbecue. Do I really want to share the whole story? Stuff like that. So, Vince, I'd love if you could put up the poll. We're going to have a poll, because I'd love to hear what you all experience, if these are things that, what impacts you most.
Yeah, absolutely. So our poll is going to be, which of the following can you relate to? Making phone calls to doctors and insurance, trying to get your doctors to believe you, explaining your condition to others, the financial burden, researching your condition, and many more. And you can also select multiple of these. You do not have to just select one.
I feel like it's rare to have one.
It is. I won't say how many I have on there, but you're right. It is rare to have, I think, just
Feel free
one.
to fill out the poll.
So it looks like right now we have quite a few responses, and it looks like the top response right now with 22% is making phone calls to doctors and insurance.
Yeah.
And behind that looks like explaining your condition to others.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, Vince. Yeah, I feel like making phone calls, people have no idea how much time that really takes from our lives. I feel like I've been on hold, like you never know, like do I end if I'm on hold for like 30 minutes, like they're probably not coming to the phone. And explaining conditions to others is particularly tough, is how much detail do you go into? So I totally relate to that. Um, this slide I wanted to put a roller coaster on because I think appointments are like roller coasters. It can be really hard because you need to have hope to kind of keep going and to keep getting yourself to appointments and to keep going to these doctors. But then sometimes you get let down and it feels like a big drop. But then there's hope again, and then there's a drop. I feel like this happens not necessarily just appointment to appointment, but within the same appointment. I've had appointments where the nurse who or like the student who's like taking my vitals and who's checking me in is wonderful, and I have so much hope and they seem interested, and then I go to the appointment and the doctor's like, what are you taking? Okay, take this, bye. And I'm like, what happened there? Like, and it's a total roller coaster. So I think that's something that obviously will cause anxiety because you don't know if you're going to bleed. You don't know how the doctor is going to react. You don't know how the nurse is going to react. You don't know all these different things. So that's something that's incredibly anxiety provoking. And there's a tool later on that I'm going to discuss that really helps to kind of deal with this. Another thing to kind of share is that, like, this happens, like, as many as there are tools and there are different things we can use, like, it's kind of just the unfortunate reality that this happens. So kind of giving yourself that validation that, like, okay, I know in advance, like kind of being ready for it. I feel like when I was earlier on in my process of like getting diagnosed and going doctor to doctor, it was very hard because I expected a lot. I expected that it was just going to be like when I was a kid and the doctor would like give me like test me for the flu and then give me the antibiotics or whatever it was, and then I'd feel better. And that's really not the experience with chronic illness. So even just preparing yourself, a lot of people in my groups will like talk about like, okay, we're prepared. We know it might not be, kind of the value of low expectations can be helpful here of like, okay, have this balance of hope, but also this kind of like taking it with a grain of salt of like there, it might not be this great experience. So kind of preparing yourself in advance for that. Something that's also, you probably know very well, is that sometimes it can be really frustrating to have a test come back negative. Like, you really want to hear or like see what's wrong. And sometimes the tests come back, or sorry, you really want it to come back positive. Sometimes the tests come back negative and you're like, well, what's wrong? I'm not sure if anyone else has experienced that. That's been a major part of my chronic illness journey, is that they didn't know what was wrong and they still kind of don't, but it was like test after test after test where they're like, you're so healthy, you're so healthy, and it can be really frustrating. So there's this like weird dichotomy of you want it to come back negative because no one wants to be sick, but then you already are sick, so you kind of want it to come back positive. And there's this weird kind of like wishing that like people who don't have a chronic illness don't really understand. We also, I don't know if this is true in Florida or the other states, I would probably hazard to guess that it is, but if you're on the My Chart system or any of those systems, you typically get your results back before the doctor even has a chance to weigh in. So I think that causes a lot of anxiety for people too, because you get these test results back and it can freak someone out when things come back. As much as I want things to come back positive to show what's wrong, it's also really stressful if things come back positive and you don't know what it is, because a lot of us, don't have medical degrees. So, as much as I've learned, and I'm sure many of you have learned well too much about the medical system and about like all these different things, there's also like the fact that we don't know a lot of the technical parts of the medical system and tests and all of that. So that can be really challenging as well. One thing that I want to make sure I didn't slip a slide. I knew I skipped a slide. Okay. Here are some practical tools that honestly you may already be familiar with. The first one I did not come up with myself. I cannot take credit for. One of my friends, Mary, came up with it. So this, I won't say out loud, but we all could read it there. But this is basically a kit for when you are prepared, and many of you may already do this, but if you go outside the house, you have a little bag where you already have stuff prepared. So for me, I know I have the little alcohol wipes for if I get nauseous. I'll have Band-Aids typically. I'll have a bunch of different stuff. So I'm like ready in case there is a medical emergency. I'll have electrolytes because I have POTS, a lot of different things. So like, I know I'm prepared, like if something were to happen. I'll have sunglasses for light sensitivity, because that's something that's really hard with chronic illness, is it's so unpredictable. For me, with the Crohn's-like symptoms, I could be totally fine, or I could have to go to the bathroom immediately, like in the middle of a conversation. It's not fun. So that can be really challenging when you're out in public or you're trying to live your life. And there's only so much this kit can help with, but it is a little bit anxiety relieving to know that you have stuff with you. So you're not just, alone. Like you're not alone in the wilderness per se. For me, I also will have like Allegra because I get very itchy with mast cell activation. So it's all up to you. It's very personalized. And this is something that can be really helpful. So you at least have some kind of security. If anyone's done, like, I'm sure many have done like an MRI where they give you like the little ball, and it's like, if you're really freaking out and you need to leave, like you could pinch the ball, and it's kind of that. It's like, you might not have to use it, and hopefully you won't have to use it. But if you do, you're happy you have it. The next one, and again, if anyone has questions about this, please feel free to put it in the Q&A feature. The next one is, these are not, can be fairly obvious things, but I think the meaning of them can be so helpful. For me, it's amazing that you all have found the Oley Foundation, so you clearly have done your research and are trying to find community. It's amazing the power that community can bring. When I first started getting sick, it threw me off. Like I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what to do. And I think having others who experience that same situation is so helpful. Many of you have probably also joined those Facebook groups for different conditions. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the Facebook groups because sometimes you join them and everyone's like miserable and you're like, this is horrible. I'm gonna like be miserable my whole life. But then you keep looking and sometimes, you find some gold. I think as many of you probably know, there's a lot out there that like doctors still don't really know yet. Like for me with rare conditions, there's a lot that like people with the conditions are genuinely more helpful sometimes than medical professionals. A quick aside, my mom actually found my MALS diagnosis, which is median arcuate ligament syndrome. My mom found the diagnosis through a Facebook group. through people who had POTS, and they had said, you should get tested. And I got tested, and that was something I had. So I think finding people with a similar experience, and again, that's why I'm so glad you found this foundation, really shows like you're putting in the work to find people. That's for caregivers too. I think it can be really hard. I mean, even watching my mom go through it, it's like not easy when you're the caregiver either. So for caregivers too, finding your own support. I know my mom's in a POTS Abilities parent, it's a cute name, POTS Abilities parents Facebook group. So parents of like adult children who have POTS. So there are definitely different things that you could find out there. And I think that can be so valuable. But you do have to wade through some of the scary stuff that's on there too. That's very anxiety provoking as well. The other thing that I find to be very helpful is having someone there for you. If you have a caregiver, if you have a friend, I know for me, I'm like a young adult, so it can seem kind of bizarre to bring someone else to an appointment. Most people my age will go to, their appointments alone and not with their mom. But I bring my mom if I can. We don't live in the same state, which is unfortunate, but I'll bring my mom, I'll involve my family, because a lot of times it's so stressful. And I find that, especially if you find your anxiety gets ramped up at these appointments, which very natural, of course it's going to, it can be really helpful to have someone there taking notes. Also, many of my friends who are in this space have started compiling different like notebooks or like scrapbooks. Honestly, you can make it into like a fun little art project, but like kind of a written document of like, this is when I had this colonoscopy, and this is when I had this procedure, and all these different things. Because in the moment, I don't know about you, but I've been asked so many times, well, when was that surgery? And I'm like, I don't know, like a couple months ago. And they're like, well, when? And we're almost expected to be historians of our own experience as well. So having these notes written down can be super helpful. I know. Okay, this one, I wanted to just kind of go a little further into the power of connection. Um, I I wasn't, this is a little embarrassing, but when I was first diagnosed with OCD, I was like very against meeting others with the same condition. I was like, oh, it'll be weird, like support groups online, especially. I was like, that's going to be so awkward. And same with when I had a chronic illness. I was like, what are they going to know? Like, mine doesn't even make sense to me. Like, how are others going to understand? But I think the power of connection is so important. I've mentioned my group a few times. I promise I'm not just trying to selfishly promote it, but finding groups online where if you have a bit of a rare condition too, there are groups that exist where I couldn't find a place where I fit in. I looked in the Crohn's Foundation, then I got misdiagnosed, and I was like, well, I can't go there anymore. And I had this undiagnosed condition for so long that's still kind of not clear, but it's hard to kind of find a space sometimes when, especially a lot of people I know, myself included, the chronic illness isn't just one thing. It's not just Crohn's. It's not just diabetes. It's not just one thing. It can be really complicated. And so the group I run has people of all different ages, of all different experiences. Like one person has undiagnosed cystic fibrosis. One person has chronic, like really bad migraines. And these are very different experiences, but we all have a very shared experience of going to doctors, not being able to do what other people our age do. And it can be really hard. Again, this is also for caregivers, also for healthcare providers. I think it's so cool that healthcare providers are here, because you deserve this connection as well. And I'm kind of going to explain a little more, but like there are ways to find these, which I honestly didn't know about before. Um, okay, I want to make sure I didn't skip a slide. Um, one of the things that is really helpful is finding a therapist. Again, I had already been in therapy, thankfully, before I had a chronic illness, but it's been so helpful for kind of dealing with and coping with a chronic illness. I can't even imagine not having that space. Um, Something I didn't know prior to having a chronic illness is that there are therapists who specialize in chronic conditions. Um, it can be really hard when your therapist doesn't get it and you're like, okay, like I explained it to all these other people and now I first have to explain it to a therapist. Like that can be really like taxing. Um, I recommend looking for someone who specializes in chronic illness. I've been shocked, genuinely shocked at how many people specialize in chronic illness. I'm part of, because clearly now I endorse Facebook, I guess, but there's a Facebook group for therapists who specialize in chronic illness. Um, so there's a way to get referrals through that. If you go on Psychology Today, again, always feel free to email me and I could find someone, I could connect you. I'm totally happy to do that. I would love to do that. I think too, unfortunately, I think it has to be said that there is a lot of stigma around mental health. And it's very impressive too that you're here today, because I don't know if a lot of people I know would even log on to a webinar like this or admit that like there is a lot of anxiety that comes from these conditions, especially if you're not familiar with the anxiety world to begin with. Like, obviously, I am very much entrenched in the world and I still deal with a lot of the stigma of being in therapy. Whereas, like, I've learned very quickly through being a therapist myself and being in therapy myself, like, it's really just a great sharing board to be able to talk to someone, especially we deal with a lot. I mean, dealing with a chronic illness is no joke. I say all the time, it's like having a full-time job that you don't get paid for. And it really is a full-time job. Thinking back to like all those calls you have to make and stuff like that. So really, you deserve this help. It's not a weakness whatsoever. I would definitely recommend too, like advocating for yourself. Like if your therapist doesn't know anything about chronic illness, you can educate them. Also, if you're like, hell no, I'm not educating someone on this now, lots of people will meet with another therapist and they'll work together. So you definitely deserve to find this care. Something that I think for the healthcare providers that can really go a long way. I know whenever my healthcare providers will mention, they'll sometimes ask, like, oh, and do you have emotional support? Like, it kind of adds to the stigma. Like, they don't, it's kind of awkward. They feel awkward asking, do you have a therapist? Do you have support? One way is really to normalize this and say, how often do you see a therapist? Even if you don't think they see a therapist, a healthcare provider, I would recommend you ask something like, how often do you see your therapist? And they might say, oh, I don't have a therapist. And that's a really good chance to be like, oh, I'd love to connect you with one. Or like, so many of my clients have therapists because this is really hard. And it really just goes to normalize it as opposed to like, so you're looking for some, have you found someone? Do you see someone? Like, it could be really awkward. So I definitely recommend asking in ways that are normalizing. Also for like caregivers, something that's really helpful is being vulnerable yourself and saying like, oh, this is really hard. Like, I have a therapist that I see. Do you want to find, like, being vulnerable yourself can be really helpful. And then this is just kind of going along with that, with dealing with the stigma. I think it's so hard, as I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record here. But I think it's so hard to deal with the stigma of a chronic illness. I think people really don't get it around, people who don't live it. Even I think I got very sick in college and I live with three of my best friends. They don't get it at all, and they lived it with me. And I think it can just be really challenging when this is our life, right? Like we don't get any escape from this. We don't get to um, go back and, deal with this later. Like, this is our life. And I think it can be really hard. So I really wanted to normalize that like, on top of everything you have to deal with the chronic illness, on top of everything that you have to deal with getting the phone calls and all of the appointments and insurance and finances and all of that, there's also a lot of stigma that we deal with. And then if you have anxiety on top of that, a lot of people don't get it. They don't get, why are you so anxious going to the doctor? I love my doctor. I get a lollipop, or, like, it can be really challenging. One thing I wanted to add too, which is something that I personally struggle with, is that a lot of times I can go and lean towards providers who are very nice, doctors who are very nice, and they seem to get it and they want to help. And a lot of times I care more about our relationship. This is where my anxiety will manifest. I care a lot about the relationship. Does this doctor like me? Do I like them? Does blah, blah, blah. Do we have a good, like, vibe going? Do they think it's fun? Do they think I'm funny? Which, like, is, like, where anxiety shows up. And it can be really hard to realize, like, okay, wait, this doctor isn't actually helping. I need to go to another doctor, because finding another doctor can be really hard. As we all know, it's not necessarily such an easy process, especially with wait times and insurance and finances and all of that. It can be so challenging. So I really wanted to normalize that. And then honestly just want to get into some questions and be able to answer any questions that anyone has. So Vince, I know we had some pre-submitted questions.
Yes, we do have a few pre-submitted questions. So thank you, Jesse, for that wonderful information. With chronic illness, many of us don't know how to manage anxiety and chronic illness well, but I think these topics you have discussed and things you have mentioned could really help the community. So thank you. I know myself, I have dealt with many feelings, as well as the community with anxiety, dealing with chronic illnesses. We are now going to ask all participants to submit your questions to the Q&A feature. That is going to be on your Teams app. We're not using the chat feature. We're using the Q&A feature. So if you could please submit your questions there. Our first question is, what tips do you have for supporting younger children to minimize or reduce anxiety once it has set in? How can we do better for her as she continues her journey? We have not found a lot of resources through the hospital or elsewhere for toddler and preschool age kids. So Jesse, if you could mention or go along that topic and see if maybe there's ways you could help for, it sounds like younger kids at this point.
Yeah, definitely. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here if that's okay. So I would say, first of all, my heart goes out to you. That can be so tough with younger kids to go through everything as a young kid. That's really hard. So heart goes out to you. Um, I think the most valuable thing can be being really vulnerable with your child themselves. It sounds like they've experienced a lot of, like, that their anxiety is kind of setting in. You've noticed that. And a big part of that is, like, again, not adding to the stigma that they might feel. And letting them know, like, you're okay, like, to deal with this anxiety. A lot of times parents can very quickly accommodate the anxiety and try to make it go away, and then it kind of shows the kid that, like, oh, mom and dad, like, this is too much for mom and dad, they can't handle this. And then they kind of, like, start, like, not showing their anxiety openly. So it's honestly kind of good the kid is being open with you. It shows that you have a very close relationship. The kid feels like they can speak with you, so that's wonderful. And so I think being really open and honest with them of, like, oh, I see this is really hard. Mommy also does really hard things. Something that can be helpful is if you find the kid is really afraid to have, like, get a shot at the doctor, for example, you could say, okay, like, I know getting a shot is really scary for mommy. I don't know, eating eating carrots is really scary. Like, I don't like the texture of carrot. This is a really weird example. But you could show something that's scary for you and be like, do you want to do it with me? Like, we can do it together. And then you guys eat the carrots and you're like, that was really hard, but we did it. And then you go into the appointment with the shot and you're like, okay, remember, we did this really hard thing, and I know you can do this really hard thing. So kind of modeling like it's okay to have this anxiety. A lot of parents will go very quickly into like kind of like shutting it down because that's normal and like that's what you want for the kid. You want them to not feel anxious, but kind of allowing that and being like, okay, this is really hard and we're going to do it together. The only other thing I would add is that it can be really helpful to, I'm not saying that kid has a diagnosed anxiety condition, but it can be helpful to get into therapists really early on. And there's a lot of research that shows like success for, really early intervention.
Thank you for answering that question. I think that was very impactful because the younger we are, it is very hard for kids to understand. And I think that what you're saying is use something at home that you can combat together, so that way you're able to use that and then say, hey, we're able to do this very difficult thing together, so let's do this other very very difficult thing together while you're at the doctor. Great answer. Next question is, what are some small or realistic steps someone can take when they feel overwhelmed by medical appointments or insurance issues?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. Such a good question. I'm just writing it down because I sometimes get brain fog and I don't want to forget what it was. Okay, so overwhelmed by appointments, I believe it was, and insurance issues. Yes, this is so common. And of course, it's so common because these are things that, we're having to do all the time. I think that's what's so hard that a lot of people don't understand about living with a chronic illness is that there's so many appointments. I know for me, my friends when I lived in college and even friends now will be like, well, why do you keep going to the doctor? Like you said, you're not feeling that much better and you don't like going. So why are you still going? And it's like, well, I can't not go. I need to get better. And so that can be really tough. So I definitely relate to that. It gets very overwhelming. I totally agree. This will happen a lot in my group that people will be like, I'm done with doctors. No more. I'm done. I'm like taking a break. I'm too overwhelmed. Like I'm not doing it. I've been here myself, where it's just too much. And so we'll take a break. Sometimes you need to take a break. Sometimes you physically cannot take that break and your health cannot take that break. But that's just to show like it gets so overwhelming that people will stop seeking medical care. I totally understand. An actionable step with that genuinely is just trying to break it down of like, I'm a big fan of like, clearly with the note stuff, like writing stuff down of like what you have to do. For me, sometimes that looks like literally only doing what a like have to do in that moment. Like, what is the emergency right now? I'm thinking about myself. I have a lot of different doctors that I need to reach out to in this moment. My MCAS is worse than my POTS. So I'm focusing on my MCAS and I'm just going to reach out to that doctor because then it gets very overwhelming. That won't work for everyone. But sometimes it's just prioritizing literally what you have to do because otherwise it can get completely overwhelming, especially if you're working or in school or doing anything and living with a chronic illness. It can be so overwhelming, especially with insurance. I know you mentioned insurance. That can be a whole other grind onto its own. So sometimes it's literally going, I cannot call insurance today. I just know it will be too much for me. I'm going to schedule a time on my calendar to do it tomorrow. I have 11 a.m. open. I'm going to call them at 11. Or it might look like, I know I've done this. This requires having someone that you feel comfortable. But I have said like, Mom, I am overwhelmed. I cannot do this anymore. Can you call this doctor? And of course, sometimes there are issues with like, oh, you're over 18 and you need to do it yourself. But sometimes it is kind of like my mom will joke she's my administrative assistant, but it is true. Like it's a full-time job. And sometimes you kind of need to offload and say, like, to your husband or your wife or your friend or someone who you really can trust, like, hey, I cannot do this. Is there any way you could pick up these meds for me? And sometimes, if you're familiar with the anxiety world, this can look like accommodation, but genuinely dealing with a chronic illness, it is so needed at some points.
I couldn't agree more. I personally have my mom help me with my health a lot. And I
Moms
find
are the
that
best.
moms are the best. I know we have some moms on here that are great, amazing moms. And I know that for me, like you're saying, it can be difficult if you're over the age of 18. But I've also found that as long as you give the insurance or whoever permission, most of the time you can do like a letter or something and they'll take down the information of the person who is willing to take over your case or speak to your doctor as well. So that will make it helpful. So that way you don't get the, unfortunately, you are too old or, we need to speak to the patient. Most of the time you can get around that by saying, hey, I would like this person or that person to be able to use my information and speak with about me as well. So that would be helpful. Let's see, we have a few more
Totally.
questions here. Let's see. How can you get a doctor to not minimize physical conditions if you express any anxiety? So it seems like this person might be worried about if they express their anxiety, that their doctors might dismiss their physical conditions and only focus on their
Hmm.
anxiety. If you could answer that one for us, please, Jesse.
That is such a good question. And that's a whole like topic unto its own. I love that question because it comes up all the time because unfortunately it happens all the time. There's a whole discussion that goes on about like if I have OCD or I have a diagnosed anxiety condition, do I tell my doctor? Do I not tell my doctor? Because unfortunately, I think a lot of people can be treated differently. And I think many of us probably have gone doctor to doctor to doctor and may have, I know I feel like I have my like core team now. And I know if I tell my gastroenterologist, he is someone who I know totally understands anxiety. I signed a release and he spoke with my therapist, which I found to be really helpful and is something they totally do. If I were to ask my dermatologist to do that, would she? Probably not. So sometimes it's knowing your doctor and kind of knowing, like, kind of sussing it out of like, okay, I think this doctor really would get it, and I feel like I can share my concerns with them. There are some doctors who, unfortunately, it's better not to share that you're experiencing anxiety. For some doctors, it's a lot better and you can go in and share. And unfortunately, I think it's just kind of by who the doctor is. If you don't know the doctor, I think unfortunately I wouldn't go in and first go with anxiety and like saying that you're experiencing anxiety because unfortunately I think sometimes that does happen, that they minimize the physical conditions, especially if you have something that is not clear cut and it is more rare. I know I experienced that a lot of like, they don't know what it is. They don't want to say they don't know what it is. Oh, she has anxiety. It must be that. Which really sucks, right? Like you're experiencing real physical symptoms. You don't want it to just be labeled as anxiety. So I hate to say it, but I would say that I would just go in with caution. And sometimes you can totally tell that there's someone who's not going to be cool with it, and someone who like you're going to be anxious about it, and you just do your best through the appointment, and then totally debrief about it after. And sometimes if you start feeling comfortable, you can share with them like I'm really anxious about this. I just wanted to let you know. And that can be really helpful. I know in my group, we've talked about it. There are some people who will go in and flat out say, like, I just wanted to let you know I'm really anxious about this. and these are real physical symptoms that I'm experiencing. It's not my anxiety. And sometimes they found that to be really beneficial. They'll report back and be like, yeah, it was really helpful with this doctor. They seem to appreciate like the like being flat out and transparent. And with some people, they're just not as receptive. And I think that's really unfortunate, but it's kind of the state that it is now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you said. There's doctors of mine that I would bring it up to, and there's doctors of mine that I really wouldn't bring it up to. But I have also found that if I talk about my physical condition first and then I go to
Yeah.
these physical conditions are not helping my anxiety, in fact, they're making them worse and things like that, then they seem to try to help as much as possible. It does look like we have a few more questions, but I just want to remind everybody, please use the Q&A feature to, if you have any questions, please submit them there. But it looks like we do have a few more here. What advice do you have for patients when emotions and anxiety start to take over during medical stays or appointments?
Oh, I totally feel that. I do want to say too, when you were talking, Vince, it just reminded me that that's really a place where healthcare providers can intervene. Like, I mean, these two kind of go hand in hand. Like when you do see that the client or the patient is getting very like emotional, or this is something that's like they seem very anxious, like you can kind of pause and be like, this is really tough. How are you experiencing this? Or kind of just like slow down. Sometimes these can be like boom, boom, boom. When was this? When was that? Tell me this. And it can be very overwhelming. So kind of as the healthcare provider, taking a second and kind of slowing down and being like, how are you doing? Can be really beneficial. Especially if you see that emotions are taking over. I've actually never had this happen in an appointment until my mom and I went to see this like she was more than a dermatologist, but she was like a very like almost an internal medicine doctor. And she said to us at the very end of the appointment, she was like, by the way, like this is a lot. Like she called me a professional patient, which I didn't know how I felt about that. But she was like, you're basically a professional patient and this is a lot. Like I hope you're like getting help for it. Like there's she mentioned that like there's medical PTSD that can happen. And she acknowledged like that's not necessarily her place. Like she's not a therapist, whatever. But it was really cool that she acknowledged that. And my mom was crying and I was like holding back tears. I feel you in the like emotions taking over. I always feel very uncomfortable crying in a doctor's office. So I felt myself like holding back tears and I was very emotional because I'd never had a doctor actually acknowledge like, damn, this is hard stuff. I feel like sometimes I feel like honestly my answer is kind of the same with the emotions taking over, that sometimes they're doctors, if you feel really comfortable with them, like you could just let it out. And sometimes it helps to let it out. And like they see that you're trying to hold it in. So sometimes it helps to just like let it out, let the emotion kind of happen. Because a lot of times, like you've been waiting so long for these appointments, you're finally getting to see this doctor. Like it is super emotional. Like, how could it not be emotional? So, um, let it out. Other times, if you know, like the doctor, like if you feel like you have to let it in, like that's really valid too. Sometimes you kind of know, as we were saying, like this doctor is not really a safe one to let it out with. But I do think it's totally fair if you're crying to say, sorry, this is just very emotional for me, or like letting them know why it is emotional. Also knowing like you're probably not the only person. If this is someone who um it is a very emotional appointment, I'm sure there are many others who become emotional. So giving yourself some space for that, because that is totally normal.
I totally agree. It is very much normal, but most of the community is a little hesitant uh, to say what's on their mind most of the time with anxiety or stuff like
Yeah,
that because they get that, they might get a little pushback or their physical condition might be brushed off for more anxiety. So I agree with
totally.
you. I think it's patient and person, doctor, whoever you're dealing with, take the time to think, but don't be afraid also, to let them know how you're doing. It looks like we have another question. What would you suggest for younger adults versus older adults dealing with anxiety and chronic illness? Is there anything you would do differently, or how would you take that question?
That's a really good question. And it's interesting because um, I don't think that okay, I don't want to misspeak here, but in the group I run, we have people who are younger, like around my age, and then we have older adults who are in their 70s, 80s ish, and I think it can be very different when you're at a different life stage, but I also think that the experiences are so similar. And I also think, by the way, that there are challenges to being young versus being older, and like I feel like I'm not taken very seriously because I'm younger, and I feel like with older folks they can sometimes not get taken seriously because they're older, so it can be really tough in that regard, because there are different challenges, but I think they're also kind of similar in the sense of like not being taken seriously. I think too, it's again, I think it's all about, I'll always harp on the community being really important, and that yes, it can be tough to be a younger person going through this, and yes, it can be tough being an older person going through this. But if you find people who get it, like it's not going to necessarily matter their age. It can be nice. I know for me, it was really nice to be able to meet other people who were around my age and who, are expected to be like when I was in college, I was expected to be going out all the time and like living life and having so much fun. Meanwhile, I was in bed at I was going to say 8 o'clock, definitely before 8 o'clock. But I think it can be really challenging um, to when there are different like societal expectations for the person. So it can be really nice to meet others your age group, but I also do think that there aren't necessarily big differences.
I couldn't agree more. I feel like when I was younger, to now I'm 33 dealing with chronic illness, it's very similar. And I feel like when I get older, I'll probably have some similarities as well. We do have about 5 minutes left, so we're just going to get to one more question and then we're going to wrap up. The last question is, what advice do you have for clinicians to create more supportive environment and having more intentional conversations so that the patients or families are able to express how they're feeling?
Oh, I love that. And I'm assuming this is a clinician, like a medical.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I love that question, and I feel like even just seeing that question gives me so much hope, because I feel like there are so many clinicians out there who care so deeply, and I've met amazing professionals along my journey. But I also think that the few bad ones will stick out, and will really make people. I know I had a really bad experience and then didn't want to go see another doctor because it can be really scary. So I love that this is a question because I think it's really neat to see that, like, even just seeing that there are clinicians who really care about making this a supportive environment, making it a place where you could actually express how you're feeling. I think something that goes a long way is making it very, I mean, I feel like I sound like a broken record here too, but making it really like normalized is like a lot of people find these challenging, like take your time answering these questions, or oh, how many days do you see a therapist, or like can we give you referrals? Lots of our clients see therapists. Do you need help finding one? As opposed to like, so you have a therapist, why are you being, just I think it goes along with like generally being like kind and open, but I think just acknowledging like that a lot of these appointments like can be pretty weighty. Like it's not just like going in and like getting like an okay for like a physical and like checking things off. They can be really weighty and they can be really scary. So normalizing that into like oh, disappoint, like it can be really hard to see a cardiologist. Like, how are you doing? Or something like that. I think having things normalized goes such a long way. As I said, with that dermatologist my mom and I saw, I was amazed that she even acknowledged, like, wow, this is a lot. And in my 4 years, I think she's the only one who's ever said, like, oh my God, I've heard your chart is really long, your chart is really disorganized, and your chart is confusing, which are all really blamey. But I've never heard, wow, your chart is really long. That must be hard. And that sent my mom and I crying. Like, even just like the acknowledgement can mean so much. So, yeah, I would say that.
I think that was a great response. If we did not get to your question, please email info@oley.org and we'll be glad to answer your question and connect you with Jesse. I do want to also mention that we have our next Community Connections Tuesday, May 28th at 7 p.m. And that is a great group where we get together and we tackle some struggles that the community is going through. And then if you'd like to also get in touch with Jesse and her support group, please let us know at info@oley.org and we will get you in touch with Jesse. Thank you so much. This has been a great experience. I think this is a great topic, and I think many of the community can relate to this. This recording will be made available on our website as well, oley.org/webinars. Don't forget to register for our upcoming events. As I spoke earlier, on May 27th, 7 p.m., we have our virtual community connections. June 3rd at 11 a.m., we'll have our next webinar. And June 17th through the 20th, our annual Oley conference in Charleston, South Carolina. This is an in-person event, and you do not want to miss it, as it will be so much fun. I don't want to give any little things away, but it's going to be a lot of fun. If you're not already, make sure you're following our social media channels and getting our emails so you're receiving updates about upcoming events, including different webinars and different things like we shared here today. Again, if you'd like to reach out to Jesse, please let us know through info@oley.org and we will get you connected with her. If you want to visit our annual conference, it is oley2025.vfairs.com, and that's where you're going to find all information for our annual conference in Charleston, South Carolina. Thank you today for our guest Jesse, and again, thank you so much, Jesse. It was a great day.
Thanks so much.